Welcome back to Why Should We Care About African Data Centers, a podcast where we tackle the big questions shaping the industry. I'm Ville Vaklin, and today we discuss the future of African data centers. In the last episode, we looked at hyperscalers, how they are moving globally and what it takes to attract them to Africa. This time, we turn our focus to what it really takes to build data centers here on the continent. We'll explore the hidden costs, the opportunity of local manufacturing, the impact of evolving AI demands, the role of regulation, and finally, something I've been really especially curious about. What can we do with all that excess heat? Whether you're an investor, operator, policymaker, or just curious about the backbone of the internet, this podcast is for you. Let's get started. Let's start with what makes building in Africa so uniquely expensive.
Constructing the data center, most of the equipment is European, it's American. So importing it here, you have to pay a premium. Their import duties in Kenya, import duties are around 45% of what the actual cost is. So it just costs more. And with the exception of before the Ukraine-Russian war, energy was cheaper in most countries in Europe than it was in Africa. That has changed. But before that, we used to have, especially in Kenya, our energy costs were a little bit higher. So that's why it was a bit more expensive. This is changing. When I joined this industry 6 years ago, it was much, much higher. So we've actually seen a slight downward. It's not significant, but a slight downward shift in cost per unit of how we charge.
Do you think it's possible to see a time where a lot of the construction materials and modular data centers are actually built in Kenya?
Yeah, we hope so. At least we have companies that are, say, European that have set up here, like Schneider, for example. And one of the advantages that, for example, our sister company in South Africa enjoys is that they have a lot of manufacturers in South Africa. So their build cost is different from our cost, for example. And when you look at our Ghanaian sister company, their import taxes are higher than the rest of us. So there are different factors that vary on how you build a data center. So we do hope that more and more companies will set up here and be able to provide the same quality that we are seeking for.
One more technical question.
Sure.
I was, working with different data center projects now in the continent and listening to different consultants and project owners. I found out that we are in the moment of the history of data centers where the design requirements are changing constantly because of the technology is changing.
Yes.
I guess the AI requirements and the racks becoming more dense, and all these have an impact on the design. So how are you future-proofing your data centers?
So I'll speak about it from our European companies because they are the ones that have implemented a lot of AI installations. And this changes significantly because let me just give you an example. So one rack cabinet for a network provider, I'm going to give an example of, say, Safaricom or Liquid Telecom or what have you, tends to use about 1 to 2 kilowatts of power. And then an enterprise like a bank will use about 4 kilowatts of power. And then when you move to cloud, it shifts to about 20 kilowatts of power per one rack. Then when you shift to denser cloud, it shifts to 50. And then the installations that we have in Europe are about 120 kilowatts per one rack, which is just incredible because this requires the amount of heat being generated to be able to pull 120 kilowatts of power for one rack. It's just incredible, and it requires a lot of energy to cool it. So the designs significantly have to change, and that's the reason why you've seen NVIDIA significantly step up, because it's producing the AI technology chips to be able to do this, because the racks and the servers are a bit different. from what they are today, what they were 5 years ago. What we have now for AI are the ones that are called GPU racks or graphic processing units. So they process more graphic data, videos, so they generate a lot of heat. So that technology is changing. So as we proceed, we've seen that the new data centers being built are being built depending on our customers. When our customers tell us we want to implement this, like we have different customers who've told us different requirements that they need in 5 years, and we are working towards designs that will be able to incorporate them because they know that we need to plan for this early enough, and they know very well that they will need this in the next maybe 2028, 2029. So it's in our vision, our strategic vision, to plan for that. And we have to change our designs entirely. So just let me give you an example. 6 years ago, the way our data center looked is not how it looks today. It's not how it's going to look in 5 years. It's going to be entirely different. But the advantage of this is that they will occupy smaller spaces. So there'll be a lot of power being drawn, but on a smaller square footage, which is good for us because land prices are just going insane.
I definitely verify that because spoke to this consultancy back in November, and they said that they just threw an 8-week-old design to the bin because it was obsolete already because something had changed. It's like, this is a mad world.
Yes, absolutely. It's changing. It's significantly changing. I know the way, because the way we do it is that sometimes when we say we have demand for maybe capacity X, and we look through all our designs, whether it's from Asia, the US, Europe, and we zero in on a design that may work and be suitable for us in Kenya, then something changes. Then we have to switch that up and adjust according to the demands of our clients. Because the same customers, you'll be surprised, same company, customers, Microsoft, Meta, Google, are in all these countries globally. So if they're demanding AI here, they will soon demand the same requirements in Africa. So we have to change our designs accordingly.
Has to be on your toes.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, it's demand-based. We have to follow how the customer needs are evolving. And they are also evolving so quickly, actually.
The strongest themes this season has been the push for data sovereignty in Africa. Faith Waitaka shares what could happen if African countries start requiring data to be processed locally and why that shift could reshape the market. She also has a clear message for global players. Don't overlook Africa when choosing locations for the next generation of AI infrastructure.
So let's look at Africa and think about the population of Africa. And we spoke about the age dynamic and how that answers to the users. So imagine these users when Africa says each and every country in Africa has a data sovereignty law where the data for that country must be processed in that country first.
Which doesn't exist at the moment, right?
Which doesn't exist at the moment. But I bet it's coming. It's only a matter of when. When that happens, that means that for all these users and all the different aspects of software or connectivity that they're using, the hyperscalers have to come and set up. And if I look at places like Kenya, Nigeria with 200 million people, Ethiopia with 126 million people, South Africa, if you look at these big places, that data sovereignty law will mean that these software companies or these hyperscalers have to come in and set up because the market already exists. So when that regulation comes into place, or when certain governments like Ghana, Kenya are considering it and they say it is time, we are getting it done, then you'll see a huge change in I call it counting megawatts. You'll see a huge change in the number of megawatts that a country used to have and what they'll have after that law. So yes, definitely Africa will grow. And secondly, we were talking about AI earlier. If you look at AI and you look at a learning facility, today, Schneider is testing one rack with 135 kilowatt in it. If I have 1,000 of those racks, how many megawatts is that? So what will happen is you go closer to the power generation places. If I had a geothermal well that was giving me 600 meg, and I quickly want to ramp up to 1.2 gig, I drop another well. So it makes more sense to do that in Africa, where you can quickly ramp up, versus doing it in places where you're going to drop a geothermal well where there's no geothermal.
Okay.
Yeah. So any way we look at it, Africa is the frontier, the next frontier, and data centers need to start evaluating how they're going to meet the demand that Africa will require.
That's super exciting. What would be your projection? How long this will take? Something that you just described. Ballpark year figure. When we will see this?
Give me an hour with 5 different presidents in Africa, and I think we can do it tomorrow. But unfortunately, this is more policy and regulation that has to do with government. So it's a matter of when governments do it. Smart Africa, for example, is the digital arm of the African Union that is driving this change. So I would say let them push for as soon as possible.
But not everyone sees the regulation the same way. I asked Ben Roberts for his take, and while he's not against local data policies, he believes overregulation could do more harm than good. For Ben, the answer lies in the regional alignment, creating an investment-friendly environment that still supports data sovereignty goals.
The driver of this is having some kind of deregulation. I was going to say freedom, but deregulation is the better word. Where you have a regulatory framework where lots of people can play in the information space. So that is to say that internet service providers can build networks to connect people. Mobile telecoms network can build different types of networks to connect people. Local cloud providers can host things, host websites, host services. Global cloud providers can come and do the same. And having a regulatory environment that makes it feasible and cost effective to do that is step one, right? So these are the changes made in Kenya, I mentioned already, in South Africa, that happened a long time ago, opening up the markets. What brings everybody together in terms of connecting within the country is generally data centers, but one very important piece of a data center called an internet exchange. Somewhere within all data centers that are successful in Africa, there could be one or more internet exchanges. In Kenya, we have, I think, at least 3 or 4, which are present across all the major data centers of Nairobi and Mombasa.
So this is interesting. You said that deregulation actually could be a way to go, opening the markets to attract more, for example, cloud investment in Kenya and Africa in general. Because I think the other guests have been kind of going more the regulation route, that there has to be stricter regulations that companies cannot host their data outside Africa. So can you give me some context to that?
I've not seen that work in any other geography, to be honest, but it certainly is. It's a mindset. If you are going to be, the thinking around data sovereignty, right, is countries want their country's data to be hosted in their country. And that's fine, and it's understandable. We all want, we understand that our data is important to us and to our nations and to our economies. And everybody wants that. However, was it the Rolling Stones said, you can't always get what you want. So it's not every economy in Africa is large enough to support standalone the investment in digital infrastructure that it needs. So not every economy, not every digital economy in Africa is ready to get suitable, cost-effective infrastructure. So you're going to get we already have hubs of connectivity. I've mentioned the countries several times, right? But where we have more investment going into data centers, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria. These are the countries that have seen the most investment already, and they will continue to be somehow special places, right? You see exactly the same in Europe. You see Frankfurt, London, and Amsterdam as being special places when it comes to connectivity. That doesn't mean everyone in Europe is left behind. Ireland came to the fold a lot later and has seen some of the biggest investment in data centers, in fact, the biggest investment in cloud data centers in Africa. Why did Ireland get that? Ireland offered some of the lowest corporate tax rates and VAT in Europe. So it became very attractive for foreign investors to come and build their data centers in Ireland rather than going to UK, Germany, and Netherlands, which already had great infrastructure, but possibly higher taxes. So now even Southern Europe is very important for connecting to Africa. So Portugal, Spain, and France, particularly, or they're the three countries that provide most connectivity to this continent, right? So you need to have, if you are going to have some semblance of data sovereignty, you need to be doing it at a Pan-African level. You need to say, okay, or our data can be stored in another African country. That would encourage more choice in doing that. However, we are not at every stage of development in these countries. We're looking at, if I'm in Kenya and someone was asking if I'd like my data to be stored in this country where there was a coup and it's under military rule and this stuff, I would say, no, I don't want my data to be stored. This is being run by a general, right? So we're not ready, right? So you kind of need to have Pan-Africanism on the regulation, but also we have difficulties. And so it's and as I say, if a country standalone says all data must be stored in my country, it might find that it makes it less attractive than it was, and it wasn't very attractive anyway for investment.
For Ben, the answer lies in regional approach, creating an investment-friendly environment that still supports data sovereignty goals. Then we spoke about LEO technology, whether that can solve the rest of the connectivity gaps in the African market. Ben walks us through the pros and cons.
A very concrete, kind of down-to-earth example. I was looking at, or seriously considering getting a Starlink, let's say 3 months ago, when it seemed impossible to set up a reliable internet in my house. And I went to the shop, and they said that sold out. Yeah. Like the Starlink has sold out Nairobi. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? Like, to me, it sounds like there's a serious capacity problem for urban areas like Nairobi for Starlink to serve. So is that correct? So can you speak about that?
Yeah. So I mean, it's almost too predictable that I predicted this, right? So when Starlink launched in Kenya, I wrote a very simple tweet, and I said, don't even think about ditching your fiber. If you're in Nairobi and you're lucky enough to have a fiber connection from Safaricom or Zuku or Liquid or anybody, don't even think about ditching that to get a Starlink. And if you do, be prepared to cry premium tears was the words I used. Right? Yeah. And this thing, a lot of people got excited, and people were saying I was just sort of speaking on behalf of terrestrial networks to protect the monopolies. But the reality is that large investment has been made in that last mile, the fiber to the home, fiber to the curb, fiber to the building. So I don't know. I don't know who your providers are, but I've just come to this place here, And I can see that, you're most likely going to have fiber options. Now, when that investment has been made to put fiber into your estate, into your building, you obviously pay a monthly subscription for that bandwidth. But there's not really the technology limits on how much bandwidth you can get over that connection are pretty much nothing. There might be some economic constraints, because your service provider might say, if you want a gigabits per second, it's going to cost you, $10,000 a month, and you say, I can't afford that. My family, we want to pay less. But you look at the price of fixed broadband in developed markets. 1 gigabits per second full fast fiber in the UK is going to cost you, less than 60, 70 pounds or something. There are not many people in Kenya who are paying that much for their broadband connection, because there's an affordability gap. Most people who are getting broadband at home, the majority, the median is kind of around $15 to $25 is what people can afford to pay for their broadband. But there are people who pay more, right? I mean, I at home pay more than this. I've just taken a package for 300 megabits per second from Liquid Telecom Kenya, my former employers, because they have recently brought down their prices. So have Safaricom. Now, it's no coincidence that they brought down their pricing after Starlink entered the market, because Starlink came in and to the market and made these offers. There was never enough capacity to serve Nairobi. Right? On the satellites, although there are many of them, there are only so many of them are over Kenya at the right angle in the sky at any one point in time, and they all use a small or a scarce amount of radio spectrum, which is the KU band spectrum. It's around about 500 megahertz of spectrum, and you can only get so much bandwidth through this. Now, when you add up, I said before, we used to serve Kenya via satellite links. At some point, there was not enough satellite links on the geostationary to serve all of Kenya. So investment had to be made in building fast mile connectivities. Mombasa into Nairobi had to be done. There was never enough bandwidth. Same goes for LEOs. There's just more satellites. There's never enough bandwidth. There are, I don't know how many people, maybe it's 5 million people in Nairobi metropolitan area. And at a quite high density, it's never enough. The United Kingdom is we're seeing this now sold out in Nairobi, but it's every African city is the same thing. In every African city where Starlink launched their services, from Lagos to Harare to Nairobi, have sold out. So is the United Kingdom. United Kingdom is one of the most densely populated countries in the world, after Singapore and a few others that are slightly more. It's a tiny little island. There's 60 million people cramped on that island. Most of the south of England is the same. It's sold out because there was never enough capacity to compete with the terrestrial networks, yet they went in with pricing to compete with terrestrial networks in order to gain market share.
Let's shift gears to something more future-looking, heat reuse. In my home country, Finland, data centers are already feeding excess heat into district heating systems that keep people warm in the long winters. So I had to ask, can this work in Africa? Could we find ways to repurpose data center heat, even in hot climates? Here's what Faith Waitaka had to say.
Houses in Kenya that need heating, I'm yet to see. I live in the highlands and we still don't need that much heating. Maybe the fireplace once in a while. The weather is pretty good here.
Exactly.
So in terms of heat reuse in our region, I would think more of greenhouses, farms. We're big on farms. If you take an area like Naivasha, where there's the geothermal, how many greenhouses do you see when you're driving up that side? So there's flowers, there's vegetables, there's all these things for export. So send all that excess heat into those greenhouses because they need it. Then they don't have to generate their own heat. You're already putting a circularity to reuse of that heat in areas like that. In areas where you don't have greenhouses, like in West Africa, maybe in Lagos on the islands, you could take the heat and use it to generate more power. So where they have gas turbines, they could take the heat from the gas turbines, from the data center, combine it, and generate more power into their facilities. So their options, their solutions, I think it's just thinking about them and making them a priority. Because remember that for most operators, you're building a facility for a particular reason, maybe to host one huge client, a hyperscaler, maybe to host a number of different clients. So these are peripherals. And that's why for me, when you asked me going green, what would be the first thing? It would be for those data centers to decide that they want to go green and to build the matrices that they want to measure. So if they want to reuse the heat, the solutions exist.
It's an exciting idea, especially if the heat can be used to support agriculture or generate additional energy. But I also wanted a second opinion. I asked Sean Worsfeld whether he thought excess heat reuse was viable in Africa today.
To answer your question, I think in a short answer is no. I think if you look at the option, some of the solutions around the world, and for instance, you explain one now, I think it was probably more of a publicity stunt, but a good thing was during, I think, the recent Paris Olympics, one of the Equinix data centers was heating one of the Olympic swimming pools. There's scenarios as well in Switzerland, I think in Zurich. There's a cheese factory that's located next to a data center, and they use the waste heat to produce cheese. District heating is a big one, and that's probably the most viable. So from a European perspective, I think district heating, when you need heating, for 5-6 months of the year. I was in Netherlands a couple of weeks ago, and it's extremely cold, so you certainly need heating in your homes for a large portion of the year. In Africa, we have obviously the converse. We have a much more of a warmer climate than a colder climate. So for something where you would have that base load and you would have it for a large portion of the year, you don't quite have that in Africa. But with that being said, I think the whole thing is, and I had a chat about this the other day, the whole thing is trying to get that symbiotic relationship. At this stage, a lot of the data center operators are, say, planning data centers, what works for them. Like we've discussed, there's connectivity, there's power, there's all these type of things. But if you want to look at waste heat regeneration and making your data center more green and these type of things, you need to look at a symbiotic relationship. So in Africa, there's certainly a lot of industry, whether it's breweries, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's food and beverage, whatever it may be. There's a large a need for the energy and from a heat perspective that a data center can give. As a brewery, you use a lot of water. There's a lot of fermentation, all these type of things. You've got all the stalls and all of that need a certain amount of energy. And if a data center can say provide preheated water or preheated energy in any means, that can help form the symbiotic relationship. But ultimately, a data center operator is not necessarily going to go to, Castle Breweries or AB InBev or Heineken and say, "Oh, you've got a facility that I want to build next to it," or "What are you guys building? We want to build our data centers next to each other so we can have this symbiotic relationship." So I think that's where governments, say within their respective countries and regions, need to get more involved to say, "Hey, we've got this area of land that we've put up over here. We're making sure there's good connectivity. We're making sure there's good, transport systems, logistics perspective, all these type of things to create kind of these symbiotic regions, if you can call it that way, where these type of players can kind of go there and feed off against each other. Maybe, maybe you make it a certain of a tax-free zone or these special economic areas where a lot of these cities are developing. You ultimately need that to drive it. And for me, I'm not necessarily seeing that in Africa because there is no real opportunity at this stage. For instance, like you see in the EU, maybe where district heating is, quite an easy one. You put a big heat exchanger up, and you transfer water to water, and you push that back, onto the district heating side, and you've gained an extra delta T of 10 degrees or whatever it may be. We don't quite have that in Africa yet. So at this stage, the focus I think on is more to get, say, Africa connected, because we do have a very small percentage of data centers globally, and we are very reliant on data sovereignty of our data being installed in Europe or the US. And of course, we're affected very much by a latency perspective as well due to the length of cable. So from that side, there's far more of a focus on that growth than I think necessarily looking, hey, how do we reuse our waste heat? And to tie into that as well, if it's not necessarily regulated by a government, ultimately you're only reporting from an ESG perspective. Yes, it would be good to sell heat and to bring that back into the financial business case of the data center and the ROI. But if a government is not saying, hey, you must sell 50% of your heat, I think a lot of data center operators are not necessarily going to go for it as part of the first call. If you look what's happening in Germany and all these regulations and so on about the PUEs and the waste heat, that's ultimately how you need to drive it. Which Africa, we are slightly behind from that perspective. And like I mentioned, we currently at this stage are looking to get connected and to build data centers than versus, to be the most sustainable and the most green at this stage.
Sean's answer, there's definitely potential, but it's not yet a top priority. It seems like, regardless of my enthusiasm, heat reuse at scale will have to wait in the African context. But I'll keep an eye on the updates in this space. So what's the takeaway? Yes, building data centers in Africa is still challenging. Costs are high and policies are still evolving. But the market is moving. We are seeing a shift towards future-ready designs and a growing awareness of regulatory impact. Even innovations like heat reuse may play a bigger role in the years ahead. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Ville Backlin, and this is Why Should We Care About African Data Centers?
This podcast is part of the Data Governance in Africa initiative, helping the African Union shape data policies, enable cross-border data flows, and build secure, sustainable digital infrastructure. Funded by the EU and 5 member states, it supports a unified digital market in Africa.